Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guests today are Walt McClay and Mike DiMartino from Voler Systems. Voler is one of the leading companies in the Bay Area, specializing in designing new products, embedded systems, medical devices, wearable devices, and IoT. They're focused on building electronics, firmware, and software. In this episode, we will focus our discussion on building wearable devices. We will talk about how their firm works with potential clients from the first interaction where they collect requirements to the time they deliver a fully functional prototype. We will cover important topics like how to keep the cost under control, expectations from project managers, the experience their team brings, the do's and don'ts in developing new products. And finally, we'll get to know why they think they bring all the advantages that China might offer for potential clients who are thinking of outsourcing their product development to other countries. I've personally worked with Voler while overseeing the development of 3 new products and thought it might be fun to bring in Walt and Mike to this podcast to share their experiences and some of the lessons learned in new product design. It was absolutely fun and great learning experience working with them. They've experienced working with big companies like Philips, Siemens, as well as very early stage startups. And they've been around for about 40 years now, and they have a lot to share. Designing hardware is hard, and designing new and functional hardware incorporating firmware and software is even harder. I'm confident that aspiring entrepreneurs trying to build hardware products will find this episode very helpful. Walt and Mike, welcome to the show. One of my goals for the podcast is to be a resource for aspiring entrepreneurs. In that context, I couldn't think of anybody better than you guys to talk about new product design and prototyping support that you offer through Voler Systems. While there's so many services you offer, for the sake of this episode, we will stick to wearable devices from design to manufacturing. Walt, how about we start with a brief summary of your experiences developing wearable devices? Give us a sense of the type of products you worked on and their applications.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. Voler has been developing products for 42 years. And in recent years, wearable devices have become really hot. The reason we got into it is because we're experts at sensors and wireless communication. And what do you know? That's a really good fit for wearables. So that's where we're focused, IoT and wearable. We've worked on a wide variety of devices, from medical devices that are attached to the chest, the abdomen, the wrist, the leg, and they're monitoring all kinds of things like breathing, heart rate, ECG, blood oxygen, sleep, and doing treatments, pain treatments, wide variety. And then there are the non-medical devices. There are simple things that are measuring motion, but you can buy those off the shelf for a long time. But when you want to put interesting things together, we get involved. So when people want to measure mood, they come to us. And mood, everybody's got a little different way of measuring mood. Or sometimes you want to detect proximity. Now, most of those all happened a year ago, and then they pretty much went with devices off the shelf. But it was a really hot need a year ago, this being 2021.
What was the most challenging of all these projects, if you have to pick one?
The most challenging is one where the customer doesn't listen. We're determined to help our customer have a success. And if they don't listen, things don't turn out as well, and they're not happy, and we're not happy. That's the biggest challenge. Now, you're probably asking about technical challenges.
Yes.
So they all have their technical challenges. Everyone is different. A device is not wearable, but has been a big project, is a heart pump. We're doing all the software and we're doing some of the electronics. That's definitely challenging. It's something that takes years to develop, perhaps the most challenging project.
You guys have been doing this for a while now. How has this space evolved over the years? Where is the industry going? And where is it currently right now?
There's a couple of important changes that have happened recently. Last year, because of the pandemic, there were a lot of things that are encouraging remote patient monitoring. So it went from a novelty to a standard way of doing things. This is a huge change. And doctors in medicine don't change rapidly, but this happened in a few months. And anybody involved in remote patient monitoring is really busy now. And it's not going to go away. Healthcare providers are discovering that it's saving money and improving outcomes. And that's a win-win. We're going to be with it forever. And it's not all wearables, but wearables is an important part of it. The other important thing that's happened is the ability to get low power communication direct to the internet. One problem with wearables is getting the data out. If you got a smartphone, fine. Your smartphone is a great way of sending it by Bluetooth LE, and it sends it by Wi-Fi or cellular. But sometimes you don't have a cell phone. And now you have low power WAN, low power wide area networks, LTE-M or CAT-M it's called, or NB-IoT. And they've been around for years, but only in the last couple of years have they become available to more than 90% of the population of the US and much of the world, so that you can now build devices that use them.
COVID definitely helped adopt a lot of new products, including Zoom, which would have been possible otherwise. I think you make an interesting point about wearable devices. Mike, you're here. Let's change the topics. If an engineer comes to you to build a wearable device, explain the process that happens from your intake of the project to your proposal and the budget that you come up with.
The starting point, of course, is doing some paperwork like NDAs and so forth. That's pretty important to understand even their level of sophistication as to whether or not they have the background corporate side together. As soon as we get that initial paperwork done, we're looking to see what the maturity level of requirements and specifications are. So requirements are sort of outward looking. What is the device going to be used for? How is it going to be used? Who are the users? Whereas specifications are more architectural of the actual technology. So those are the things that we're looking at early on. We're also evaluating who it is that's coming to us relative to their own expertise in hardware and how they might make design decisions. From a standpoint of product development, a typical wearable device is going to be done in 3 stages. The first stage is finalizing those specifications and requirements, along with a viable architecture of the technology. In other words, we want to see that this particular solution makes sense given the functionality of chips in the market, sensors in the market, how much power they might be expecting to use, how they're intending to communicate. We want to lay out all of those things in phase 1. The reason why we do that is because in phase 2, we're designing the prototype. And we want that to be as linear a process as is possible. We don't want to have excursions, field trips of technology investigations that could have been handled during the architectural phase. Surely it's not a simple task. So there is going to be some level of engineering work that is exploratory. But if there are too many what I'll call degrees of freedom, you end up spinning. And I use the example many times of having a balloon in your hand and you squish it and it pops out between these fingers, but then you squish it with your left hand and it pops out between those fingers. You don't want that scenario in phase 2. You want to be doing the work so that you end up with a prototype that is perfectly functional. Phase 3 is where you take it into manufacturing. A functional prototype is built for the purpose of essentially proving that you can make all of this functionality occur with the components that you've selected and the firmware that you've developed and the mechanical engineering package around the device's electronics. And then you want to convert it at that point to manufacturing. As you go through this with an engineer or with an entrepreneur, you also need to begin giving them some numbers about what the length of time is and the budget might be. And we've looked at wearable devices that take a minimum of $150,000, and we've looked at devices that are very complex with multiple sensors and lots of processing going on that might be close to $2 million from beginning to end to develop. So there's a wide range, and you want to make sure that the schedule time that they're expecting, the budget that they have, and then the steps that we're doing make sense for them.
That is very neat. The three-phase approach is very understandable. It looks like there's a huge amount of risk management that occurs in phase one. Can you walk through some of the risk management processes that you have when a project comes to you?
The risk management is mostly an evaluation of the people, team, and some of the basics of the technology. Because with sufficient money, you can often overcome a technical challenge, but no matter what's involved, you have to understand and characterize the people that we're working with. So a big chunk of the risk management is determining how many people are there at the client location. Have they done a product before? Have they done a medical device before? Do they have experience in testing and regulatory? Obviously, we're a business, so we also need to know what their financial status is. Are they funding this out of friends and family money? Do they have a VC already? Are they wealthy? Are they an established company with revenue and they're funding it out of revenue? A big company like IBM would fund out of revenue or something in that nature. So that qualifies the partnership that we have with the people and their business. But then we have to review their sales deck, their specification. We look for glaring problems. I'll give you an example of a glaring problem one time. Client comes to me, says he has $2 million, but he can't get further funding. They got to get the project done and get to market. And I'm thinking to myself, $2 million, that sounds great. That's a good number for us. So second meeting, he says that in order for this product to be viable, we have to hit a $45 bill of material cost. And he said that in the first year, we have to be able to build 50,000 pieces. So let's take these three numbers. They've got $2 million in funding. They need to have a $45 BOM, and they need to build 50,000 pieces, which equals $2.5 million just for the materials on the first build. No money left over for paying Voler or any other expense in the whole project. And these types of things are more common than you'd actually expect. I'm not trying to disrespect those that come to us by any means, but there's a certain level of excitement that somehow blinds some of the presenters to the aspects of weakness in their project. And that risk management exercise that you're talking to, Walt and I have done this quite a lot, and we act as advisors, quite frankly, for the first few weeks of the engagement, even when we're not in a contract. We're giving them ideas about things that they have to do or issues that we see that immediately arise on first inspection of their documentation.
That is a nice story. I see this very often. There's a disconnect between the budget they have and the product they want to build and the goals they have. I like that story. If you don't mind, how did you solve that problem? Break it down for us.
The $45 bill of material cost is a business plan metric, and you cannot alter that really. I mean, we could probably spend time in the middle of the project to improve the bill of material cost, but going into the project as a feasibility exercise, we have to say to ourselves, the $45 bill of material cost is a business plan metric that is make or break. Their market is adjusted to a demand and a price quantity that is $45. So we can't modify that. Obviously, we're not going to build 50,000 pieces. One of the things that Walt and I believe in, and the reason why I think we've been able to work with very successful clients, is that we really believe in getting a product to market and getting the feedback on a new product and not worrying about making sure that Home Depot can have 50,000 of these pieces in their supply chain. The more important thing is getting it to market as soon as possible and getting the feedback so that a future revision of the product can be maximally successful, as opposed to thinking that your first swing at the first pitch is going to lead to a home run and you close down the game and you've won. It doesn't quite work that way in technology.
You bring up a good point about a price in the business plan. This is a question that comes up with investors often. They ask entrepreneurs how much it's going to cost. And entrepreneurs trying to convince that investor that it's going to cost not much. What do you advise entrepreneurs respond to that question? When an investor asks an entrepreneur, what is it going to cost? Keeping all these feasibility and development costs in mind.
I think to me, the best answer is working backwards from what will an individual or an enterprise in the market pay for this device? Because in the medical space, you have reimbursable issues. In the digital health space, you have large scale companies, Facebook and Apple, that can do things at a level that no entrepreneur is ever even going to get close to. So working backwards, the question becomes, what will the market bear as a price for this? And then you can use just a simple number like 25% becomes your bill of material cost. That's as good an early swag at how the business model will work as any.
Let me add something. Oftentimes people go to a contract manufacturer with an idea and ask them what it'll cost to build. And the contract manufacturer's answer is, well, you give me a bomb and I'll give you the cost. Well, it hasn't been designed yet. Now, what we can do is we can do some estimates even before it's designed, and we can get you a ballpark that's based on some experience. It's certainly not going to be the accuracy that a contract manufacturer would give you, but it's something.
Walt, what have you seen that these entrepreneurs or clients most need from you? What repeats itself when they come to you? What is common in the ways you've been helping them?
The most common thing is not having complete requirements. And it's not just new entrepreneurs. Well-established companies have the same problem. And I completely understand. You have an idea, you have a pretty good idea of what you want, but to describe it in enough detail for an engineer to actually design it without going off and doing something you didn't intend, you need a lot of detail. And sometimes there are things in there that people don't know about or don't understand. So there's advice we give even prior to doing a proposal. There's advice we give as part of the first phase. And it comes from understanding the technology. And sometimes I have people come to me and I realize they don't have the requirements because they don't know their market. And my advice is you go do some market research before you come to us, or you're going to waste all your time and money.
I've seen on your webpage that you have clients like Philips Healthcare, Siemens, Boston Scientific, Stanford University, and startups. Why are they coming to you? What are they missing internally, and why are you more successful than them in designing a prototype or building a product?
Partly it's because it's all we do is design. We're really good at design. And we're really good at the project management that makes it successful and on schedule and on budget. But there's another thing. Even large companies, you take any group in there and they may not have all the skills. They may be making mechanical products and now they want to add electronics to it. They want to make it transmit data, pick up sensors. Then they need somebody outside the company, because developing your own skills, building a team can take a year. And sometimes after a year, you just still don't have a really high-performing team. So if you're well-funded, you can't afford to do that. You need to move quickly.
I think another thing that's important is that, generally speaking, the companies and people that come to us are not actively doing multiple products all at the same time within their domain of expertise. Voler is doing anywhere between 20 and 40 products simultaneously, and we can cross-pollinate our learning from various products. Walt gave you a list earlier, for example, of different wireless protocols. After you use a wireless protocol 3 or 4 times on different products, you understand how to implement it. Somebody else is really at the bottom of that learning curve. And so the steeper part, we've already walked through the valley of death and slaughtered the soldiers along the way. So that's a huge advantage that I think sometimes people don't really appreciate until they've engaged us and we're talking about this particular aspect of advertising beacons on Bluetooth. And to them, it was Bluetooth is Bluetooth. And if they had gone down that on their own, they would be going through the same turmoil that we might have gone through 2 years ago.
Some valid points there. I did my share of mistakes. I worked with you guys building up 2 or 3 products by now, and I did all the mistakes in the book, and we'll come back to my mistakes later. Walt, you talked about project management, and Mike, you mentioned about one of the things you're looking for is the team that an entrepreneur or a startup might have when you're engaging with them. Talk about the project management that happens. It can make or break that whole deal. So what are the best practices in terms of project management that you guys have observed and people should look out for?
To start with, you need really good requirements. Just as an example, we've taken on projects where another consultant failed. And I asked the entrepreneur, so give me your requirements. We spent 5 minutes talking about it, didn't have anything written down. Well, no wonder the consultant failed. It wasn't just his fault. If you don't have written requirements, you're bound to have problems. So we help people make requirements that are complete enough that the engineers aren't making decisions about the user experience, for example. Communication is critical all through the project. We have normally weekly meetings. I've found that communications is more important than the technical issues in most cases. The engineers are really good at technical issues, and they're not so good at communication. So you need to help make sure they communicate well. And you need to be very open. I'm not going to hide something from the customer because they're going to find out about it, and the sooner the better.
I think the people that I've worked with as project manager roles that really spend the time to prepare a presentation or really vet an Excel spreadsheet really make everything so much easier, because people show up occasionally from the client management role and they want to see a quick summary. People in the engineering department all of a sudden realize that an electronics solution also requires a mechanical solution. And how do you integrate the development of those two together? Somebody says, this particular part is a problem. Who's going to go out and investigate this one little part and spend time on that during a period of time where everybody else is busy? And that project manager, being sort of a jack of all trades, but at the same time, always being organized and detailed and always being aware of the communication requirements to make something succeed, it almost is just the blessing of the good programs to have somebody of that competence through the whole project.
Coming up with good requirements and communication, open communication is pretty key, is that takeaway from there. We'll slightly shift gears. Building hardware is very hard. Unlike software where you can change code, once you build something, it's going to be complete redesign. With that comes cost implications. They go out of control. How do you keep costs under control? What are the best practices that you recommend?
The first thing is to have good requirements.
It's all about requirements, yes.
It is. That's why it's so critical and so often not done well enough. With good requirements, we can do an accurate estimate and we can stay on budget and on schedule. Now, you also need to be able to recognize risks. So if you've got a technical risk that suddenly blows up and makes it very difficult, then you've just blown your budget and your schedule. So you've got to recognize that and deal with it very early. That's something you deal with in phase one. You make sure that your architecture is feasible and doesn't have a big challenge in it. I think those are the key things. And who's doing the estimate has to be somebody experienced. If it's the first time you're doing an estimate, you're not going to be so good at it.
Any observations from you, Mike?
Yeah, so the middle part of the project is really where you can get into some interesting challenges, because oftentimes with entrepreneurs and early stage startups, there's a desire to get going and things change a little bit in their mind. Sometimes it's a push from their funding group. Sometimes it's feedback from a R&D lab device that they have given to a doctor for use in a therapy or a diagnosis or something of that nature. Or sometimes even a market will change a little bit in a longer project. So if you have a good project manager, you can keep the project going, but also explain what the outlook is. You talk about costs going out of control, and in a way, the majority of the cases are not out of control as much as a new analysis is needed given changes. And so they're completely in control, but it is different than the original estimate.
Change is something that you have to allow. You can't say no changes. Lots of changes is a problem. So you have to carefully balance that. And that means you need to analyze, okay, is this change really important or not? So that's very important to keeping your project on schedule and on budget. And sometimes you say, okay, we need a big change. It's going to change the schedule and budget, but it's justified. But you have to look at it carefully.
The worst scenario is incremental periodic changes. One is better off letting the engineering team continue down a path that is not exactly what you want, batch up your changes, stop the project, implement or decide on all of the items in the batch, and then carry forward. Because different things, again, using that balloon analogy of squishing and it popping out between this finger and that finger, if you're changing multiple things, first change A in week 2, second change B in week 5, third change C in week 9, the implication of the week 9 change may revisit what you decided in week 2. So consequently, you really have to concern yourself with the flavor of the week problem that can occur. And the way to combat that is to say, we're going to let this go to week 5 with what we've been doing, and we're going to bulk up this list. And then we're going to take the CTO and the head of engineering, the technical lead at Voler, and the head of the engineering work for the mechanical. And we're going to all sit around and say, these are the things that we want to change. How would we best do that? That's a much better approach than saying this week it's got to be $2 less. And then 3 weeks later, say it's got to be a different wireless solution than what we originally decided. And then the 4th week, we say, well, it's got to last 2 hours longer. And then on week 9, we say, well, we've got to decrease the size by 30%. That type of approach will literally triple the cost. And remember, we were talking from a range of 150 to 2 million. Now you're talking about $500,000 to 6 million if you continue down that path, doing incremental changes where you never get stability in the design. We've never had anything go to 6 million. We're in the crowd that that's not a viable number whatsoever, but it would if you just continue down a path of every 3 weeks, 18-month program making a change. It would cause that type of eventual financial outcome.
That is a great piece of advice. I think just holding off till your requirements, till a certain point is reached, and then try to implement the next version with these new changes. That is happening very often with early stage founders. They want to have everything in the first version they're trying to build. That is when the costs blow out and everything is chaos.
Here's a key piece of advice. We've talked about requirements. We've talked about project manager. We've talked about weekly status meeting and communication. It is the least desirable situation for an entrepreneur on the weekly status meeting to suggest forcefully that there should be a change in the design direction. If you want to do that, create an offline meeting, be very specific about who should attend that offline meeting, and hold that discussion outside the greater framework of all of the engineers, because engineers are problem solvers. Engineers will take that direction and run with it and even get excited about it and start planning for it and make changes in the product. And you don't really want that to happen unless it's really been thought through and approved at the business level as well.
This is one of the mistakes we did. I'm sure Walt remembers. I won't take the company's name, but we suddenly come and say like, oh, we wanted 2 cameras. Now we're going to need 3 or 4 cameras. We want to change this in this version of the product, and then just spirals down the cost.
The one thing that I've learned is you'll always make mistakes. You'll never be perfect. But if you learn from your mistakes, you can get better and better.
Yep. Let's shift the gears into the regulatory aspect of it. Looks like you work with a bunch of partners while building products. Give us a sense of the kinds of partners you work to build a great product.
Just about anything electronic needs an enclosure. So mechanical designers we work with all the time. And in most products, looks is important. So an industrial designer is needed to make it look beautiful or make it look a certain way. When you get into regulatory, There's meeting compliance requirements. So there are specialists in understanding those requirements. For medical, there's regulatory and quality requirements. There's transfer to manufacturing. One common problem that companies have, particularly larger companies, is the engineers are done. They send the drawings off to manufacturing and they never say anything further. And then manufacturing struggles with whatever was missing or misunderstood. It's important to have a smooth transfer to manufacturing. And we help with that. We have partners that help with that. And then selecting a manufacturer that works well for your volume and your type of product. Not every manufacturer is the same.
For anything that has to do with medical, there should already be a FDA regulatory strategy and a honest depiction and definition of where the entrepreneur stands relative to a quality system that they're going to use in conjunction with that FDA application process. That should happen really before they have approached us. We're here to implement something in a way that is part of the requirements. And we get into a situation where, is it going to be class 1, class 2, class 3? Is it a predicate 510K or is it a PMA type of device? And if all of that hasn't been worked through with the entrepreneur, we could make some serious mistakes about how we go about doing the design effort, the number of revisions that are necessary, how the revision that's going to be used for clinical trials or for the FDA audit or the different compliance steps involved. We have to factor all of that in. And if they haven't defined the goal line, it's really hard to make a decision as to what we should do tactically in order to make this happen. The same thing exists on the contract manufacturer side. You really have to understand how it is you're going to get this product into the marketplace. When you're talking about wearables as an example, there can be quite a lot of decision making in manufacturing about the adhesives and about the backing for the adhesives and what's disposable and not disposable. And if there's no strategy in place, we can help and make that decision. But that can be a long discussion before you even start talking about the electronics technology. So being prepared in advance, not assuming that your Arduino board represents a half step away from volume production, those types of things are really critical in advance of coming to us.
Speaking of helping entrepreneurs, can you give some examples of the kinds of entrepreneurs that come to you? Assuming there are people like me who don't have an engineering background that come to you, and there are people with engineering background. If you have a couple of stories of the products that you developed with different kinds of entrepreneurs to give a sense of your capabilities.
There's such a wide variety of entrepreneurs. There's some people that have no technical background, but they understand the basics of technology well enough to make good decisions. Now, when it comes down to actually designing the product, they should have somebody technical involved with that. But some people are able to understand basically what they need, even without the technical background. And some people are not. The most important thing is to recognize what your skills are and to do what you're good at and get another member of your team who's good at what you're not good at.
And the interesting thing is that the ones that don't have technical backgrounds, by and large, tend to be less financially viable as well. And so when they don't have the technical background, we have to be the ones that guide them through the requirements and specifications. We're the ones that have to show them how the firmware relates to the user experience and give them the translation, if you will, of what they're thinking about for the product versus what we need to do on the technology side. I'll give you an example. We had somebody come in with a muscle stimulation device. And these people are hardcore workout people, probably a resting heartbeat of 20 or something like that. And they wanted to do something with muscle stim. And so we said, well, how wide is the stimulation turning knob? How aggressive and non-aggressive do you want this stimulation to be? And everybody looked at each other and wondered who was going to speak next because there was no understanding of what would be involved with just a simple device that we would call a potentiometer amplitude characteristic of what we were going to implement. There was no appreciation of how that mapped to the product that they were looking for. So these are the types of things that we have to work with. And we do work with anybody. It's just that if it's less technical, somebody has to bear that burden, and that becomes us, which means that it costs more. And that's what you have to face. On the other end of the spectrum, you get somebody that has an engineering background, they've developed products before. And in those situations, you get down into very, very hardcore, small technical things like, is the USB signal interfering with the operation of a particular sensor because the processor is doing too many interrupts? And so it's just a completely different flavor of conversation, both in terms of efficiency as well as in terms of how long it takes vis-a-vis getting everything in a requirement or specification, and that turns into money. So ultimately, you can sort of suggest that the less technical will be a premium cost in many cases simply because of the amount of extra effort to do things the right way. The worst situation, of course, is that you get somebody who doesn't have technical and they don't want to spend the money, and we try to sort of sidestep some of the key elements, and then the thing doesn't work. And we can't really even explain why it doesn't work other than to point a finger, which is the last thing that you want to do. Voler's made its name by being a partner, not only in technology, but in business model. And so the worst outcome is the idea that you have something that doesn't work, that's more expensive than the original thought of the entrepreneur, even though we said to them, well, you're adding X tens of thousands of dollars because you can't give me the answer to this.
You're almost like an extended team for smaller teams that don't have those resources. And personally, I feel that working with a team like yours is a great benefit for startups. Some of the mistakes I did was with my first startup, I decided to take the prototype development to India. I thought it's going to be cheaper. That's a story. That's a narrative. You go to China, you go to India, it's cheaper. I fell for that. I was a novice then. Long story short, we lost a lot of money, didn't come up with a good prototype, and come back to the US. I think you guys were one of the first stop for me. Again, it came down to requirements, building the right prototype. There is a general taboo, especially among some of the investors. They're like, oh, you're outsourcing the product development to somebody else. I just want to explain it to the investors and to people who are considering this as a good option. Can you give a spiel from your side? Why is it good to work with folks like yourself?
So if you're an entrepreneur and you just got well funded and now you need to execute quickly and have really good results, you can't afford to fail. The last thing you want to do is spend a year developing a team and delay your introduction by a year. Even if you have people you know, if they're not already a team working together, experienced with this type of project, they're not going to do it as quickly or efficiently.
I think that also going with somebody that is a partner as opposed to a vendor is huge. And when you're working internationally, really it comes down to being a vendor because you just can't get that timeshare, mind share going. You're really buying a service. Whereas with Voler, we're sort of shoulder to shoulder in the trench doing the work, both the financial modeling work as well as the technical work. We're an advisor. We see the challenges and we solve them. We're right up front, like Walt said earlier. We see a problem that is arising. We yell it out. And that's the last thing that overseas groups do. They hide problems because of cultural, symbolic of failure, or not being good at communicating negative things, not being problem solvers, not having that Silicon Valley mentality of fail fast. All of those types of things are just not there. And then the final thing is China has something that Voler has in a different way. If you want to build something, you go to China because there's 100 companies that the guy at the manufacturer knows that can polish metal a certain way or deliver a wire harness a certain way. They have this incredible ecosystem. Voler has that same ecosystem for design. If we have a problem with an antenna, we can call up our friend in northwest part of the United States who does antenna design 24/7. We can't employ him every day of the week because we don't have that type of volume of antenna work. But we know who he is. He works with us. He likes working with us. He can solve the client's problems. As an entrepreneur or a young firm, you simply can't have those Rolodexes. And so if you want to build something that's going to be tricky, going to China for ecosystem, if that doesn't bother you for IP purposes, it's awesome. If you want to do some type of design, you want to be in Silicon Valley with companies that have really big Rolodexes and solved problems and can call up the right person. Just like when you have a problem at your house, you don't start one day and try to figure out why your electrical panel has a fuse breaker that keeps tripping, or why your toilet is running, or whatever. You might be able to solve one or two of those, but you can't solve your whole house. The same thing is with Voler. We can call on the hundreds of people that we know and augment our entrepreneurs' 3-person executive team with a group that can bring every value that is possible to the program.
I think what an entrepreneur should look for is a partner as opposed to a vendor early on. I did that mistake again. Another great point was they don't communicate well. They can't say no, or they won't say that something won't work. And I realized it the hard way. So many lessons in here for early stage entrepreneurs. Walt, who is doing some of the best research in the wearable space? Universities, companies, individuals?
Clearly, the universities are doing the most research. They come up with all kinds of innovative, novel things. One thing you got to pay attention to is generally it's not ready for commercialization. So people will sometimes say, I see this university has this great technology. Let's use it. They used a chip that's not available on the market. So there's a problem. Or they got it to work once in the lab, but it's not going to work for everybody without calibration. There's a lot of work left to do to make it commercialized. So you got to be careful when you take this technology. Very often companies are built around technology coming from universities, and they can do this very successfully. So it's good. You just have to be aware of how to do it.
Any university that stands out in your mind?
In the Bay Area, Stanford and UC Berkeley, you've got a lot of technology coming out of there and a lot of companies being developed.
Mike, observations from you?
I think that Walt hit the nail on the head. There's things like some new power solutions, some new wearable materials, definitely a number of new sensors that are coming out at all times. And if you stay on top of certain mailing lists, you can get very excited. But the fact is that they're probably, in most cases, at least 5 years away from being a commercial product that you can go to a distributor and buy for the use in your volume manufacturing bid. We're seeing things like power handling with graphene, or we're seeing fabrics with embedded impedance monitoring and things of that nature. Sure, if you're Nike, you might have a simple fabric wearable already in place. But for somebody that's trying to do this as an entrepreneur, it's just going to take some time. In the sensor areas, things that are happening there, I find to be really compelling, because oftentimes the sensor companies that are emerging have people that came from IC companies, or have people that came from electronic component distribution and so forth. So they understand the whole get to market opportunity, and they're looking for options in terms of implementations that might be useful to popularize that particular device. Anytime you're dealing with that, it's a longer process. As an electrical engineer, designer, combination of instantiating or making the schematic work for the new component and making the firmware work for the new component is just longer than if you took something that was already popular off the shelf. But that's where you get the new value add. That's where you get the exciting revolutionary products. You just have to be aware that it's going to take a little bit longer.
As the Moore's Law is coming to an end, where do we see the next innovation coming from that can advance the functionality and adoption of wearables, in your opinions?
Maybe Mike will have a good answer. My ability to see the future isn't very good. I can remember in February of last year saying, In China, they can tell people to sequester, but they'll never do that in the US. And then a few weeks later, I was wrong. So I don't know where it's going to come from, but it's likely to come from somewhere that we're not expecting.
I'd agree. My perspective always is that wearables are more about the data than the hardware. So most times, somebody that comes to us with a wearable requirement is maybe sometimes not as focused as they should be on the fact that they're trying to get diagnostic or therapeutic information to an endpoint for evaluation, whether that's a doctor-patient relationship, whether that's an AI machine learning solution, whether that is a scientific study to prove a hypothesis about a particular product's capability to help. It's all about the data. And so consequently, where I see the biggest innovation coming, if you will, is making that process easier to occur. We've been asked to build cloud solutions, do certain types of apps, make particular sensors speak to the data pathway less and more frequently with less and more data. And that's where I think the innovation for the near term will be, is creating a sense of efficiency and throughput with less challenges so that more of these devices can come to fruition.
It's all about data, it seems. As we come to the close, what is a piece of advice you both have to anybody trying to build a wearable?
Requirements. The planning in advance of what it should do is the most important thing. We can make it work if we know what it's supposed to do.
What's unique about wearables is you've got a bunch of trade-offs that you've got to make. You've got certain things you want to measure. You've got certain data that you want to transmit, and you've got a certain battery size and a battery life that you need to deal with. And you're not going to get the optimum solution. The optimum solution would be you'd never charge the battery. It's not feasible. So you've got to pick the right combination. First, you got to understand the technology and what those trade-offs are. And then you got to go back to what your customers need and make the best choices. We can help you with the technical side. You're going to have to go and understand your market well enough to make the right choices.
Awesome. Any plugins from Voler as we come to close?
I don't think we have to say anymore. If you want a project done on budget, on schedule, and with high quality results, we're the guys to go to.
Walt and Mike, this has been fun. I've learned so much in this episode. I'm sure the audience is going to be learning a lot. And I wish you both good luck with Voler. And I hope you continue to build and help entrepreneurs build great products. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Naresh.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.